Hey, today I spoke with Azeem Azhar, who is a longtime technologist who runs Exponential View, where he does some great technology and AI analysis. I think this conversation is a little too wide ranging for me to give a short summary, so I'll just let it speak for itself. I hope you enjoy, and let me know what you think. This is the Gradient Podcast. I'm Daniel Bashir. The best way you can help me out with this project is by sharing it with people you know and by leaving ratings and feedback. And before we begin, this episode is sponsored by the world's first AI Quality Conference. Colina and the MLOps community have teamed up to host this event in San Francisco on June 25th about rigorous, reliable, and scalable AI. You'll hear about Cruise's recent AI efforts, as well as from speakers coming from Anthropic, Notion, OpenAI, and many other places. You can use the discount code Hallucinate to get 30% off their ticket price. And now, without further ado, Azeem Azhar. You've been writing about the idea of, exponentials for a long, long time. Exponential is kind of everywhere in your work. You use the word a lot. And I've recently been engaged with some people who have thoughts about exponentials, and they are that things might be not so clean as they seem. So two things I have in mind actually are, one, what you had just mentioned, which is an essay that was recently published in The Gradient about how transformative AI might be really, really hard to achieve. But also in mind that I have is some work by a philosopher at Vanderbilt that I came across pretty recently, and I spoke to him about, which kind of comes up against some of these ideas like the singularity hypothesis, not to group you with people who are advocating that at all, but I do think he makes some pretty important points about what defenders of the singularity hypothesis need to be able to defend, which is just not just exponential growth, but sustained exponential growth. And I think you have a more moderate version of this when you talk about S-curves and how that works in the growth of technology. But I do want to kind of understand, there's like pushback against the idea that everything kind of gets transformed very cleanly into a different world. And so I want to maybe start with, let's take the word exponential and the way you think and maybe start complicating it a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. And I really enjoyed the essay that you're referring to. I think it's why transformative AI might be harder to achieve or something like that. I think it's worth, if listeners haven't read it, to go back to your archive and read it. I have been a child of the computer revolution. My first computer, which if you're on video, you can just see behind me, ZX81. It's got a Z80 chip in it, just above my thumb, from 1981. I was born actually the year after the 4004 was packaged. It was the first commercially available microprocessor. And I've lived through kind of Moore's law humming around behind me and through my career over that period of time. And I remember when I was first working in the early 90s, mid 90s, meeting people from the Bay Area, and they would, in the excitement of getting across the idea of what's happening in computing, they would say, your car does not get twice as fast every 2 years or half as cheap, right? Which is the kind of, you just put it on the denominator. And so we got evidence proof that for 50 or 60 years, you can have an exponential or strongly nonlinear process that runs and creates with it lots of value and over time starts to transform the way people live. But the thing that I noticed in about 2014 or 2015 was that you could see that pattern in other domains, domains like the price of lithium-ion batteries, the cost of solar photovoltaic cells, the cost to sequence the genome or any kind of animals, genetic material, and I was looking at those processes and saying, how come we have so many different technologies that essentially decline in price by this significant amount, 10, 20%. You can choose a sort of arbitrary cutoff. I use 10% and do so consistently over decades, right? 20 years in the case of genes, 50 in the case of solar photovoltaic, slightly longer, actually more like 65. And we know what's happening with Moore's law. And that led me to see what some of the academic research was and start to build my own theory about why we see this happen. Now, look, if you're a mathematician, you can quibble for a number of reasons, right? Any fixed percentage change is an exponential. 0.25% a year is an exponential. What you're trying to do when you're communicating an idea like this is find a way of getting the idea in people's heads and then in a way that is real, that they can put their hands around. So I said, 10% per year. I said it's happening in markets, so it's a bit wobbly. There's a bit of turbulence, and the thing is that we have seen it, and it's very, very hard to bet against. What was the point at which you should bet against, say, the cost of computing for an end user developer starting to go up, right? Because even though we've hit this moment where the gains from Moore's law are much slower now, those are the gains from effectively cramming more components that are smaller and smaller onto a sort of physical substrate. That's slowed down a lot. But what we started to do was move workloads of a certain type onto GPUs, which are growing at, Jensen calls humbly Huang's law, right? Even faster than that. And actually, if you're a developer, you can buy the capacity that you want from AWS, and it's super cheap. So when you start to take a business perspective, an economic perspective, which is how much does it cost for me to access the capacity I need to fulfill that business function, and is it coming down in these big steps repeatedly? I think we see that pattern happening. And I think back to the first time I ran a Hadoop cluster, or my team ran a Hadoop cluster on AWS back in 2010, 2011, and we spun up 1,000 cores, which is an enormous number at the time, for the hour that we needed it. And had we had to go off and buy those and put them in a data center and ... that cost would have been prohibitive. So the way that I look at exponentials is number one, let's try to see if there is some kind of fundamental process that explains why this might get cheaper. And number two, if it's getting cheaper, is it actually getting cheaper in the market? And what does that then do to expand the market?
The fundamental process point is really interesting. And I want to bring in a couple of ideas that might come to bear on this. One of the things, and this was quite a few years ago, and I think by now is not really a new idea to anyone, but one thing that was a bit of a frame shift for me and my understanding was when I was first coming across some of Ben Thompson's ideas, and he brought out the point that Moore's law that you just spoke about that's not a fundamental law of nature or something. It's actually a social contract.
It is, yeah.
And very much so with a lot of what we're talking about, that these things are moving along at a certain pace is sort of a promise of sorts, that the people who are building them, who are building the infrastructure around them, really want this to be the case. We are willing to work in order to bring these things to people. And I think when it comes to like kind of fundamental laws, there's all these questions about what happens when you start running against the barriers of physics. When it comes to other things, progress in ML, for example, another thing that I had in mind was this paper about our ideas getting harder to find. That came from a few economists. And so I kind of wonder, because I don't bet against things going fast either, but I'm sort of curious, when you start thinking about, you have talked about sort of S-curves and technology adoption, but when it comes to the pace of things, how you think about a couple of these things that one might consider wrenches when it comes to the speed of progress.
Well, I think Moore's law was a social agreement. It became so important for the industry and for the industry to meet expectations right across the supply chain, and it was roughly true, but there's no real theory behind it. But you couldn't have a Moore's law, Daniel, in internal combustion engines, because the law of physics and the Carnot cycle says you can't get any more efficient than we've got, right? So there are these laws of physics, and the question is where do they live? The better law is that has got some validity is Wright's law. It's this idea of learning and learning rates, and essentially in complex engineered products there are so many elements in which there can be made optimizations, right? So the first time you build something, you don't think about the optimizations, you just think about getting it to work. And then after that, you can build optimizations, and that should reduce your cost. And what we're interested in really here is cost. So miniaturization, which was the strategy used for aspects of Moore's law, is one strategy for driving costs down, because in general, miniature things are, they require less energy, they require less physical stuff, they're kind of cheaper to make, although the factory is expensive in the case of the chips. And so you do end up with learning rates, and when you go out of the lab and you go into kind of the industrial world, it seems like learning rates can be 15% for every doubling of cumulative production, and much, much faster for some products, as they have been for semiconductors. And so we will at some point hit certain laws of physics, and arguably we hit that with chips a while back. We had that whole problem with heat dissipation. What we started to do was develop things like multiple cores on single dies. We've now got things like gate-all-round transistors, which get around not the law of physics, but the limitations of the previous design pattern. And of course, you can't extend this forever. There are only so many atoms in the universe, right? So at some point, we're gonna run out of things to use. Although what we know is that the laws of physics don't change, but we discover new laws, and once we discover new laws, we discover new ways of manipulating what we think of as as matter, right? So we could put men on the moon 55 years ago using Newtonian physics, but we couldn't do GPS with Newtonian physics, right? We needed Einsteinian physics to do GPS. So I wouldn't count against better understanding of physics being able to, over the maybe not the decades but the centuries, help us move things move things forward. What happens on this other idea, which was you said, like, our idea is getting harder to find. What we're seeing there, I think, is a couple of things. One is that we have got increasingly complex systems of knowledge, right? So there are, these are things that lend themselves much more to Metcalfe's law of complexity, right? So there's just it's a kind of polynomial number of connections between the scientists and the knowledge, which makes it harder to push through to find new ideas. But the second thing is that I think we shouldn't forget that the structure of knowledge and the way in which we look out for knowledge has a sociological component to it. And so that sociological component is that academics are forced into narrower and narrower and narrower domains now. And they very rarely have the opportunity, because of the way funding works and the way tenure works, to look outside those domains. And now I haven't seen a study that looks at that particular effect to say, does that actually hinder our ability to explore the landscape of possible scientific theorems, because we've been so busy just exploiting our little local maxima within our domains. And I would say that I tend to try to be quite measured about what I say, but one area where I am a little bit feel there is a path for some optimism is that the new AI technologies that you write about so brilliantly are really good at cutting across silos, right? Because we basically put all the scientific knowledge into an LLM, and then we say, I'm an immunologist, what can I learn from quantum theory? Or I'm a material scientist, what useful things could I get out of complex fluid dynamics? Help me. Right. And you could start to do that. You could start to break down those silos. I mean, I'm not sure if it would, it's going to result in the next Huygens or Newton, but it will at least provide one tool that might break down the silos that I think have sort of infected formal academia in the last 30 years.
Yeah, you and your analysts have also written a lot about some of these particular things that could happen. And When it comes to the narrowing of domains in academia, that's something that really fascinates me also because as you said, there's this problem of incentives and tenure and all this and just the social structure of the academy in certain ways. And I've seen this crop up in some pretty interesting ways recently. So I spoke to a philosopher at Vanderbilt recently named David Thorstad, who is working on developing this program of bounded rationality, which is really interesting. And he's coming up against what were sort of previous programs for characterizing human rationality that were, if you go and look into economics, for example, a lot of economics literature assumes or used to assume that people were rational agents and that we're almost logically omniscient in certain ways. And these are not the most realistic assumptions to make. And the bounded rationality program and coming up against this, it's really interesting. And to an extent, I think if you're maybe a layperson coming at this, it also feels obvious. Of course, our cognition is limited in certain ways. But the fact that it's actually kind of difficult for him to craft a program like this in academia because of its interdisciplinary nature. He talked about that sort of difficulty, and that was just so interesting to me. I think he talked about having struggled a little bit with the publication ecosystem because of this. I think things are getting a little bit better now, but the fight against that was really interesting. And thinking about the timelines for all this too, it feels like when you're thinking about the crafting of different disciplines and they're coming together, at the outset, you probably do want a discipline to be focused on like developing itself, to have an understanding of what it is to be that discipline before you start interdisciplinary stuff. That's something Terry Winograd told me. But that makes me think about when it comes to the sort of contributions, especially in spaces like AI and what you're talking about, that mixing together and some of the maybe academic problems one might run up against in trying to do really interdisciplinary work, it's not great to see. And so I think, like you, yeah, I'm hopeful that we see something better.
Yeah, and I mean, let's put some historical context around some of this. So, one reason we ended up with the idea of the rational agent, it comes from the modeling of systems capabilities that we had at the time. So you have the emergence of modern physics. And in the 18th and 19th century, which gave rise to people like the physiocrats who had these ideas of aggregates and equilibriums and the gas laws, and those ideas moved to the aggregates that we look at in economics, and that's why economics has this sense of looking at the world as if you're looking at a mixture of gases, right? Which makes sense, by the way, because I don't think it makes a lot of sense to model a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon as an agent-based system, right? It just like it doesn't. What does it actually tell you? Um, and so I think you can see the connections between disciplines and therefore their limitations. But what's been, I think, increasingly clear is that there are new methodologies that exist. So one is graph theory, which dates back to Euler in the 18th century, and network theory, which you really start seeing emerge once again in the 70s, I guess. And funnily enough, with people like Pierre Bourdieu, who are not mathematicians at all, and that technique I think is quite interesting because you now see it applied, of course, not just in computer networks, but also in, when you look at protein activation in kind of physiological context, when you look at the immune system, that sort of maths is making its way across disciplines. And when you get to machine learning and AI, I mean, here's the thing. Jeff Hinton is a neuroscientist, and Demis went off and studied neuroscience. And what we're actually seeing with a whole bunch of the breakthroughs of the last, more than the last 12 years, is one domain that I think, and you may have a better view than me, intersects those disciplines. So where I might take maybe a slightly different view to Winograd, or maybe it's the same view and I didn't quite pick up how you present it, is just that as scientists, we will go off and explore, and you'll find a local maximum, and when you get there, you need to spend a bit of time exploiting it, and that before you start to explore in other directions. And I think it probably is the case that once you have started to make a bit of progress, you have some of the domains of art that allow you to make continuous progress. But there also comes a time where you probably can't go any further. And I think that that's what we may have seen in the pre-deep learning, machine learning world. I remember people trying to use support vector machines for text classification in 2001, or things like trying to find hidden factors, latent variables, using things like latent Dirichlet allocations for topic modeling in like 2005, 6, 7. I mean, this stuff looked great on paper. It just didn't work. And what it took was for us to get to the next level actually was this set of work that came from neural networks, where many of the people working with them had some bit of cross-disciplinarity about them.
There's a lot of important things you said there, and I do think that's really broadly a right view. One thing I'm remembering earlier that you talked about too, because you're talking also about this, we might go along under the auspices of a single paradigm, a single way of doing things, and what's underlying that seems to work really, really well for a while, but then we seem to come up against its limits. And you spoke earlier about sometimes what this calls for is a change in the design pattern, or a change in the kind of like ontological basis, almost in like the Kuhnian sense, maybe. And that makes a really big difference. You talk about this concept of the society of AI, and this very much agrees with Venkatesh Rao, who I spoke to recently as well, who I think is not a fan or thinks that the current kind of monolithic scaling paradigm that we're under right now is going to run up against limits. And I think I very broadly agree with that. And I think that you two have somewhat similar, like, high level ideas on this front. But I'm kind of curious just to maybe hear you talk a little bit, without prompting you too much, about how you think about the current kind of monolithic scaling paradigm and some of the limits there.
Well, I'm on the outside of these firms, and so I can only do my best by talking to them and hearing what they have to say, and hoping that I've given them enough whiskey to open up, but not so much that they're making it up. So assuming I hit that Goldilocks spot, I the sense I get from the big monolithic LLM peddlers, I like to call them, is that they feel that there's a little bit longer for the scaling hypothesis to run. And I heard last year, I heard 2 to 3 years more we feel comfortable with. And just a few days ago, I spoke with somebody from one of them, and they said, well, last year we thought we've definitely got a year more of this, and it's a year on, and we're definitely certain we've got a year more. And so it's a sort of reverse of the quantum computing problem, which is that it's always 5 years away. They've always got an extra year of the scaling hypothesis. And I think if we don't really have experience of systems that learn from as much experience as these LLMs are learning from. As humans, we learn over a matter of a couple of billion seconds or something. I mean, it's just not that much, and we learn at 18 bits per second. And so the amount of experience we actually get in the world beyond what is, unleashed through our sort of genetic systems is pretty limited. So in a way, we're in really, really uncharted territory, and there's a lot of data. There's still a lot more data that is that is out there for these systems to learn from. I mean, at 7 or 8 trillion tokens, there's more in the internet. There's a lot of newspapers that are not on there. Are they even useful? There's cultural knowledge. There's new ways of encoding. New modes that can be put in, and so I wonder whether the limit there is actually going to be, an economic one. So we're in a stage where we're nearly at that game of powers and of 10 for the training cost for every subsequent model. So let's just kind of work that out. If the models today are going to cost $1 billion to train, then next year, even with all the great work that custom silicon people and NVIDIA and so on will do, and Grok and Cerebras, will be at $10 billion. And the year after that, we'll be at $100 billion. And, global assets under management is only 100 trillion. So at 100 billion, we're only 3 more magnitudes away from all of the assets that humanity has to do your next training run. And so even if it's not every year, it's every 18 months. I mean, that is within that's within measurable time for periods of time. So I think that that's possibly more likely to be the. That's a constraint that feels much clearer. Who is going to pay for it? Could you even get the electricity to do that? Could we crank out enough chips in enough time? Remember, these are powers of 10. So at some point, I think that our industrial capacity on this particular trajectory has to reach a limit. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. It's also interesting to hear you say that, and tell me if I got it wrong, but I think recently you had also written this. This was kind of in the wake of the whole Sam Altman is raising $7 trillion news, and you had published this analysis entitled "A Trillion Here, a Trillion There, and soon you've got real money." It seemed like you were kind of taking this, yes, a trillion actually sounds like a lot, but maybe in the grand scheme of things, it might not be as much as we're making it out to be or something. And that was an interesting connection to something I'd heard much earlier too, when GPT-3 had just come out, the idea that actually GPT-3, if you think about it on the scale of maybe a government budget, you could actually imagine something orders of magnitude larger in terms of investment. And I recall there were some people wondering, why doesn't the government actually try to pursue this as far as it would go? Because actually, the government budget that you might be able to put into this would be, at least when it comes to economic barriers, a good way of putting the kind of money into it to see how far we can go along the scaling path. And I'm curious how you think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that I wondered that as well, myself, and I suppose the point is really that there's still risk involved and there's uncertainty involved. I think Epoch, who track scaling, have only been running that blog for a couple of years. So it's very difficult to go to a government, or frankly anyone who's managing $1 trillion of investments, which is a very small number of people in sovereign wealth funds and insurers, and say, well, here's a blog that's a week old that says if you put $100 billion into processing, we'll create this enormous economic asset. So yeah, you give it more than a week. Yeah, it's got to be a bit older. So I think that the other thing is that we don't actually know. So we don't. I don't think we know. We know right now how you would build a safe model 1,000 times bigger than the ones we have, right? So what's going on is there's a co-evolution of know-how, practice, and optimizations that are going on in these companies as they build the last model, and they say, what are the things that we need to do differently? Where are their optimizations? What other research can we bring in? It's not just about data and chips. So I think that it still has to be done incrementally. And if you think about where Sam Altman has come from, he has come from the ultimate, build Hoover Dam scale successful projects through iteration. He's not a waterfall chart guy. He is we can build a multi-billion-dollar business but you give it the right amount of capital at each moment on the journey. And I think that's what was so significant about him saying we need trillions of dollars for chips. It's about his conviction, whether it's self-serving or not, that they're on a trajectory and he's seeing something. And my point in that essay really was that it's people were hating on that because it was Sam Altman who said it. And if a vanilla equity analyst had gone off and said, well, based on current forecasts, we think the semiconductor industry will spend $4 trillion on capex in the next decade, it wouldn't have even made CNBC, right? It was just a nothing. I think it was more of a personal gripe that he would have the chutzpah to do that. But I think if you look at the numbers and you look at the capex expectations, and you also look at our historical trajectory of how we've used compute, it doesn't seem unreasonable. I mean, there are 2 billion cars in the world. Over the course of the next decade, pretty much every one of them will be replaced. Certainly every single car in the US and Western Europe in 10 years' time will have like a supercomputer in it, right? So we've already scaled up. There'll be twin GPU, NVIDIA or Qualcomm equivalents in every vehicle. I mean, we're definitely on that track where the demand for compute, which means the demand for chips, is going to be rising.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. It was interesting to me, though, that you just said that the kind of news this makes and maybe the vitriol you'd see in the among the very online of us would be pretty different if an analyst said something versus when Sam Altman says this. And what I kind of read into that is a few things. I mean, one is the like agency aspect of it, because Sam Altman talking about this is he's actually talking to sovereign wealth funds in Saudi Arabia and all of these places. And so there is this sense of, oh no, he's actually going to do this. And then analyst, it's like, where is that 4 trillion it's spending going to go? Who's going to do it? And so there isn't as much this sense of action, but then also the trust component. I mean, I think a lot of people do find Sam Altman to be a pretty trustworthy guy, and a lot of people do not. A lot of people see him as pretty self-serving. I'm kind of curious how you think about that almost psychological reaction, because you've also spent some time with these people. I mean, you've spoken to Sam, you've spoken to Dario Amodei.
Well, I find Sam inscrutable. I mean, my read on Sam is like Schrodinger's read, because I will sometimes feel he's picked my pocket, and sometimes I feel he's absolutely the most plain-spoken, direct guy. And actually, I would say when I meet him one-to-one, and I've interviewed him a few times and so on, I really think he's a clear communicator who has this great style where he gives you the prize, the most important line in the first sentence when he responds to you, and then he explains why. So there's no, you already know you're getting your M&M. But then you get reports coming back about through the press, and you think what's really going on. Let's be clear here. He's very polished. He's got to get across really complex, contentious ideas. He wants to win as well, and he's done this for a really, really long time, and he has a reputation of being a phenomenal deal maker, where the deal tilts in his favor. So I don't think that makes him that different to other successful business people or entrepreneurs over time. He's just doing it on a particularly visible technology. I think the other thing is just that he is pretty consistent in what he said over the last with the exception of the whole what is the structure of OpenAI and what are we trying to do here, from where there's been a big shift, but he's been quite consistent about what happened, what he thinks will happen with jobs, why you need to have energy, and so on. And maybe part of the challenge is that what we're actually seeing is a lot of power, not just agency, but power being vested in a single person at a time when the places we might go to hold that person in check are not capable of it. So the politicians are not capable of it. The competitors are not really capable of it because they're in a desperate race. The media, especially in the US, has found itself in a really, really divisive spot right now. So when you could have trusted the Journal or the New York Times 20 years ago to sort of really peer under the hood of a company, even if they did now, half of the audience wouldn't believe them. So I think that is something that we have to be a little bit concerned with. And I talked with Connor Leahy, who's an AI risk expert, and his asteroid, Don't Look Up style, coming towards Earth is sort of AGI, and mine is institutional weakness, and us giving up the idea of separations of powers, giving up the idea of freedom to act, which have been and freedom to think, which have been the things that have allowed Western society to become quite resilient and quite wealthy, because we are nervous of this, this Deus ex machina event of AGI. And so that one of the things that I see with Sam, that I think however nice or not nice people with power are, they need to have adequate counterparties who can counterweight them.
That seems very much right. I want to dig into those two asteroids you just mentioned because I think they make for an interesting contrast. And personally, I feel like I'm more on your side than Connor's on this. But it is interesting the word AGI has certainly come back into fashion again. And there's a lot of hand wringing, and a lot of people, myself probably included, academics, are a little annoyed with the overuse of the term, I suppose. It means lots of different things to different people. So maybe where I'll start is, how do you think about, like, what does AGI mean to you?
I try to avoid using the term, except to ask people what they mean by it. I think the intelligence is a very, very many dimensional thing. So it exists on a frontier, and so it is something at 0.10 greater than something at 0.01 when they're both 1 unit away from the center. I don't know. And in some sense, by some definitions, if you're playing around with GPT-4, it's quite, it kind of feels AGI-ish without a body. I can throw it questions and it does far better than the median human in everything I set it. So I tend not to define it, and partly because we don't have really solid definitions, but also partly because what we can define is the machine. We can explain what the machine is, and we can explain specific outputs against a particular benchmark. And I imagine that what happens, and this is where I will sort of depart from people who think there's going to be a fast takeoff, is that we co-evolve our practices with these technologies as they make their way into our daily lives, and so and what happens with that co-evolution is that we just notice that our life is getting a little bit easier. We're getting a bit more done. Maybe we're feeling a bit more well informed. Maybe we feel we're making progress on a particular intellectual problem we've been worrying about, or a simple list we had to make about stuff we needed for our garden, and that process, keeps going, back and forth, and at some point we end up with language for it. Now, the criticism of that view is this. Number one, we didn't figure it out with iPhones, right? iPhones showed up. No one knew how to behave with them. We didn't know how to give them, whether we should give them to our kids or not. We don't know what norms and rules and behaviors around the dining table are. I mean, I wrote about this in my book. And the other argument is this is going to happen really, really quickly. This will, GPT-5 will be able to write a Hollywood script. If it's not GPT-5, it'll be GPT-6, and it will be not just indistinguishable, but better than the thing that comes out of the best script writers. And so I think if you believe in that approach, then the question is, how do people actually deal with that? And my experience has been, I've had that moment of just putting my pen down, thinking, what is the point of my doing any research? Because Perplexity and GPT-4 will get 98% of the way there. But actually, it just turned out that there was still more within me, and there remains more within me. And then I look at what's happened to chess, where more people play chess now than have ever played chess, because they I don't know, they're motivated by the pleasure of it. So I think that I shy away from defining AGI just for that particular set of complex reasons. It just doesn't feel like it's something that has a clear endpoint, like we put a man on the moon or we sent Falcon 9 up to refuel the ISS, right? It's just, it doesn't feel like it has that endpoint. But what do you think? I mean, do you have a definition?
I want to register an agreement and then kind of ask you about something you said. But yeah, I also shy away from definitions. And I think this is in part for many of the reasons you mentioned, but I also think that there's this historicism. And actually, when I was speaking to Venkatesh Rao, he gave some really interesting historical context that I think I was kind of aware of, but he put it in such a way that I had better reasons, I think, for the trouble I already have with terms like intelligence, which was, again, when we're looking at right now, before we go into the history, we do a lot of comparing LLMs to humans. And as you said, a lot of this is we're looking at particular tasks and seeing how they perform on them in terms of accuracy percentages, things like this. And then we take that to be some measure of quote unquote general reasoning ability or intelligence. And that's a little bit difficult to justify. I also find what it is to be a quote unquote fair comparison between an LLM and a human difficult. So when I read a lot of papers that will do these comparisons on different points, I also think about, I don't feel like we have a good theory of what is actually a fair comparison between these things. That just seems like a very fundamentally hard thing to work out. So that's one thing that I have trouble with. But the other two is just the use of the term intelligence itself. And I think we could look at this even broadly, because you think about the way that these terms came about, the way the G factor came about through what were once civil service examinations. And then the way Venkat kind of put this was the like other countries sort of took a page out of China's book and started doing what were basically standardized tests for people who wanted to enter the bureaucracy. And so this is what eventually turned into your standard IQ tests. And then we kind of grafted this term intelligence on top of what was basically something almost like a personality test, is the way he put it. And maybe you read a little bit more deeply into it than personality. But you can also kind of view the choices that were made about what to test as being arbitrary, because people made those choices in a historical context based off of what was important to them at the time that people do. And then we have this term intelligence. And then now what we read into it is that it's this kind of up there in the sky thing that is like, very much indicative of a lot more than it used to be.
Let's play a game with that though, Daniel, because that's super interesting, right? So let's take that idea, right, which is that we used it as it established it as a way of selecting in particular ways, and then what has happened and what happened in China was that if you didn't have a social capital route up, you could do the exams and you could take that capital route up. And it happens in India as well, right? They test for people for IIT and IIM, and 5,000 people all get 100%, and there are only 500 places, whatever it happens to be. And they've ended up designing systems of advancement and hierarchy and accumulation around those particular tests. And so the one argument could be that lots of the structures in which we live today are the shape they are and incentivize the way they are as a consequence of the test, the things that we were measuring 100 years ago. And so the reason it's interesting, I mean, look, I've just made that up, right? Because I was listening to what you said, and then maybe there's something in it. But if we play that tape a bit further, it would then say that, well, if it turns out that those things are actually not that important, then there will be other traits that will be important. So there were traits that mattered for advancement that people carried with them that were not captured in a GEA, like just a generalized intelligence measure. So we can imagine what those traits were: who your dad was, what month, what star sign you were born under, how much religious knowledge you had. And those things we said, well, we got a different way. Maybe it was better, maybe it wasn't. We haven't been able to run the one where astrological ecclesiasts have run the planet for the last 100 years to see if that was better than the outcome we've had there. But we did have these traits that we trusted, and then we stopped trusting them, and we trusted a new set. And so you could say, well, why wouldn't we go through a similar process? And I was talking to a friend of mine, the dad of a friend of mine, the other day. Is an 82-year-old accountant, and when he started in accounts, they didn't even have electronic calculators. They had these mechanical one-armed bandits to do the adding up, and so they were really good at that skill. And he said he can look at a printout from a spreadsheet and he can feel a mistake. You know how Ilya wants to feel the AGI? He can feel a mistake. And my dad, who passed away a couple of years ago, was an accountant of the same generation. Same thing. He could look at a page of numbers and go, no, there's something wrong there, around here somewhere. And that skill now is not as useful, right? Because Excel does as its internal reconciliations. So maybe this is less of a worry if you are kind of progressively minded, and much more of a worry if you're like a Burkean conservative who doesn't want the world to change that fast, who still wants G and the Wechsel and the Stanford Binet IQ score to be the thing that determines life outcomes. I don't know. I mean, you've challenged me. You have to think. You'll go and think about that. And I think then the next stage beyond that, of course, is this changes if the digital intelligences that we build and then build themselves achieve some kind of moral capacity, right? If they achieve some kind of moral capacity and moral agency, then the way in which we will need to think about them will be different. Now, the question is, when will that actually be? And I think that's an even harder question than the question of what is AGI. But again, the way that I'm talking about this, it's so interesting philosophically, but it just doesn't. It doesn't feel like, even with the rapidity of the changes and the way that we can depend on the scaling laws, that we're there yet.
Yeah, the conservative picture of this is interesting, and like not one that I agree with, because I don't think that we should be going back to like Stanford Binet and all this. And when we speak about this sort of coevolution, it is interesting to me you brought up the maybe a new set of things are going to matter, because I do think we're kind of beginning to struggle with a version of that already. I mean, I think that with the existing and projected capabilities of LLMs, we are starting to see how, when you're looking at assessing a student's knowledge in the classroom, for instance, that is starting to, the way people think about that is starting to change. And so we're having to figure out once again what is it we actually want students to know and to be able to do. And I think that in various places you've quoted Shane Legg's definition of general intelligence as having the sort of ability to accomplish goals. And I feel like that's kind of high level and vague enough to be comfortable, right? Because it's like, it doesn't matter the way you're doing things, the specific set of tasks you might be good at. It's can you do a thing almost? And that quality of like usefulness, I guess, seems to be at its core really, really important.
Yes, it is. But we just don't know. I mean, I think that you've asked the question of what should students learn, and I have a son who's at university now. He's studying maths, and um, but his personality is such that he actually wants to know this material. There's also lots of stuff he just doesn't want to know because he'll say I can get it on the internet, but he wants to know his subject. So he does work with GPT-4 or something to, as a study buddy, but he does his assignments on his own. And then the question is not so much whether that's useful; it's whether he or we appreciate and enjoy doing that, because the number of agents that are going to be able to do those tasks, right, who are going to be able to prove Euler's identity, right, e to the pi I plus 1 equals 0, is going to expand dramatically over the next few years. And a lot of the ways in which we think about the world and we think about knowledge have been really constrained by our ability to hold stuff in our head and then to be able to explore those pathways. And I'm just going to give you a really example here, right? So when I'm using an LLM and I'm doing some research and I'm asking it some critical questions, I will get to a fork where I'll go, I want to challenge point 2. I also want to challenge point 3. And what I'll have to do is I'll have to copy the sessions into 2 different windows and then ask them. And then I might get to another fork. And then at some point, there's just too much going on for me in my little poor head, and it's 7 slots, to figure out, where I am. And the moment I start writing this all down, it's absurd. It's like I'm going back to my quill pen while I've got an AI to help me. But we're at the we are at the point where today people could literally do this. They'll certainly be able to do it more and more. You could kick off an orchestrator LLM to fire off lots of agents down all of the subpaths to critique and criticize and evaluate and go cross-disciplinary for every single one of those. So we're going to explore that knowledge frontier, find analogic relationships or even new concepts at a rate that we have not been able to, that maybe a great polymath could do in a few years, we'll be able to do in minutes or seconds. And I think that's really weird. And I have no idea what that what that does and what that means and how we make sense of it. I already, when I'm working on my book, and I've been looking at the evolution of cuneiform today, and I've got some academic papers, and I've been challenging myself through a couple of LLM windows. I mean, I get tired halfway through the day. Like, I'm intellectually tired at the pace with which I'm being hammered by these systems while I'm reading these documents, and that I think will be something that I can't. I think weird is probably the best way of describing it. Like, it's going to get really, really weird when we can start to string these things together in a semi-agentic way.
I think that'll be a really interesting moment, and I too don't entirely know what to make of it. You had said something earlier that I want to connect this to, though, where you were speaking about the usage of Perplexity and GPT-4 for doing things like the kind of analysis you do. And I suppose, it's interesting as a thought experiment to imagine what happens when these systems are capable of taking over more and more of the things that we consider kind of core to our identities and to our careers and what we just like doing. But you had also said at that point that you still feel there is something within you that isn't quite captured in Perplexity and GPT-4 and so on. And I'm wondering if, when you were making that statement, did you see that as this is true now and might not be true later? Or do you do you kind of have evolving thoughts on this? What is it uniquely to be human kind of question that I think a lot of us are continuing to wrestle with every time, new technologies get more advanced?
Um, I There are lots of humans who can do all of the things that I can do, and there are many of them can do things that I do much better than I do. But I'm still me, and I still wake up and pootle down to my study in the at the end of the garden, and I've got my nice speakers, and I listen to music, and I read, and I talk to people, and I do work, and I'm still me. I do go through a process of um, I go through a process where I have felt that moment of just wanting to put the pen down and walk away. Ethan Mollick, who writes a great Substack and has got a book on LLMs coming out, calls it the existential crisis that everyone has to go through. Mine was that I'm working on my second book, and I put my first one into Claude. I've got the proposal for my second book already squared away, and so on. And I said, listen, this is who I am, and this is my first book. Give me 3 different potential second books that somehow connect, but they could be close or quite far from the first one. And it came up with these 3 decent paragraphs, each of which were part of the subset of 5 or 6 that I had thought of as like, what should I do the second book on? And the second was actually the second book idea. And then I went over to GPT-4, and I said, I kind of started to talk to it and shared some material with it. And I said, listen, I've gotten this new concept that's coming up, and it's a new word. It's a neologism, right? So it's not out there in Google. And I said, come up with 7 or 8 different words that could describe this new concept. And lo and behold, in there was the new word that I had already come up with and typed in 50 times already in my manuscript. So that, for me, those were moments where I thought, oh God, what's the point? And but on the other hand, what I found is it's tremendously enabling. I mean, it has enabled me, and it's created more space for me to do other things, because what it can't do is it can't decide. Right? It can't decide, and it doesn't have. I mean, we've got the ultimate Polanyi tacit knowledge here, because in my head I have the architecture of this book, and I can't write. It is not written down yet, because it will only be written down once I've written it down. And so the LLM can't train on those tokens, because once it's trained on the tokens, there's no point, because I've already done it. And when you write a book anyway, you go through the editing process and readers and submissions. And so the final work, of course, is yours, but it's got a lot of people in it. So I look at it, and I think that that certainly for my style of work, even if I was getting perfect paragraphs of finished prose, which I never get because I never ask for them, I'm always working on the research layer. That wouldn't be the end of it, because I still have to take action and decisions and things that look like agency over that work. So yeah, I mean, I think that the process still works. And then, of course, Daniel, you'll have heard this from all the people you've spoken to. They'll say, yeah, well, what happens at GPT-8 when the machine produces a better book, Azeem, than you can, even when you're supported by the internet and Sci-Hub and LLMs, right? What then? I don't really have a great answer to that one. I don't know if you do.
I feel like in this, I always keep thinking back to, I mean, getting at this, like, what is it to be human question? And I don't know in what way it manifests, but I always think back to my high school freshman English class was a class that was focused on precisely the question, what does it mean to be human? And one of the very last readings we did in this class was the Nobel Prize speech that William Faulkner gave. And it is something that has stuck with me to this day. And I feel like when I kind of think about these questions, like you're asking what happens when GPT-8 I can't help but thinking about his point that it is the poets, the symphonies of Beethoven and things like that, that at the last gasp of humanity, those are going to be the things that stand out as defining this question of what it meant to be human. I'm wondering about this. I mean, this maybe gets into questions of sentience and all these weird overloaded terms, but I guess I think about this distinction between like nonfiction and fiction, because nonfiction is something that I do think very reasonably these systems that do all the research they do are going to be able to do very competently. And I do think that when it's less personal and more about presenting facts and information, that is something that's going to be very competent. And maybe when you kind of have the personal story, if you want to bring that in, then a system like GPT-8, 9, etc., can help you with bringing that all together. And maybe you believe that they can kind of construct these stories so as to be compelling. But when it comes to things like fiction, for instance, I've always felt that fiction is kind of this unique lens into understanding the human condition that no other form of writing can really offer. Not to say that an LLM couldn't write a compelling piece of fiction, but when I think about the kind of fiction that reaches the heights of, again, what it is to be human and allowing us some kind of insight into that, that still feels like something unique for me. And I don't know, maybe we'll kind of have that Hofstadter moment when he saw computer systems creating music or something where this all falls to pieces. But that's like the thing in my head I always go back to.
I think one of the things about fiction is that the possibility space that it occupies. I mean, this is a horrible thing to do to fiction, and I apologize, but the possibility space that it occupies is just really, really wide. And if you look at literary fiction in particular, so I'm not talking about the kind of John Grisham's Da Vinci Code style of writing. Literary fiction is just expressed in so many different ways. You know, it ranges from a book that'll have a chapter without punctuation that will run for 800 pages to a book where each chapter is 1 page long and sometimes only 4 words long, except for the chapter that isn't. And so there's just a lot more, degrees of freedom. And I think the way in which authors think, I know a little bit about this from peering over my wife's shoulder, who sort of studies this stuff, is that they really peel to threads that are very, very, very deep below the words that actually come out. And they used the word, I want to complicate this, in your first question to me. They use this idea of complicating. How are we going to complicate this, and make it less of a simple, straightforward, once upon a time moment? So I think there is something in this idea that that fiction, which relies on judgment, is going to remain something that we can distinctly connect to. But I think there's another thing that will happen over the next set of time, bearing in mind again the essay that you shared, we talked about right at the beginning of this discussion, bearing in mind the things that Václav Smil constantly reminds us of, that these things take longer, that there's drag in the system, but there is a trajectory of countries that as they get richer, living on more and more complex and automated infrastructures. And so, I assume that you just go to your faucet, your tap, and you turn the water, and the water's clean to drink. And you don't go off and run a bunch of unit tests and look at operations logs and figure out whether you should drink the water, because you've established a set of trust with an automated infrastructure, which is your water utility. And we have these automated systems in our world, the economy being one, that we trust very highly. We know that when we click that button saying, send me a squeaky rubber chicken on Amazon Prime, it's going to arrive within 2 days. And a lot of complicated stuff happens that we don't know about, but it happens, and squeaky rubber chicken arrives in our home. And I think that to your point about facts or this and fact-based systems will increasingly become automated and will start to take the characteristics of infrastructure, which is in a sense is a socialized element of our societies because we all share it and it's expensive to build for one person. And I think one of the interesting new areas of governance will be how do we choose to govern these automated infrastructures, because they are unlike the water system where it's very clear what we want it to do. We want it to deliver clean, potable water, sufficient for cooking and cleaning and drinking. And that's normally what the firms are told they have to do. And that's what our expectation is. And if we want to do something weird and wacky, we have to get a permit. But the expectations of the other automated infrastructures are going to be harder to identify, right? Because they're going to be so embedded in, even if they're fact-based, they're going to be embedded in values, as we've seen with sort of recent things with LLMs. And how we choose to govern that, I think, will be a human process, even if the tools that govern the systems are they themselves automated. Presumably we don't send people to reservoirs with dipsticks. We have largely got the monitoring systems sort of just sitting there. And I think that is a area where humans continue to have some, kind of ongoing level of engagement. And then the question is, what is actually the economics of all of that?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that it's still a big question. What do we want the world to look like with systems like this? And it's hard to articulate for a number of reasons, I feel. I mean, I think just number one is that question of knowing what we want is a hard one all by itself. But then also with the technologies changing as we go, what do I want my world to look like with GPT-4 existing in that world is a very different question from what do I want my world to look like when GPT-10 exists in that world. And so it can be a little bit difficult without having to project and make assumptions. But
can I just I want to jump in on that, because here's a great example where we've got a problem. So no one asked if we all wanted a supercomputer in our pocket. Right? I mean, no one asked, and the reason no one asked was because, to be honest, the idea was just not. It didn't compute, right? Apart from Kurzweil, even if you were a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs, I mean, Gates imagined a world where every home had a computer. And he probably imagined the second bounce of that ball, this idea it would build complementary services around it. But did he imagine the third or the fourth bounces of that ball? Did he imagine 121 billion identity attacks a day, which is what Microsoft gets on its network, 4,000 a second? I'm not sure if he did. You should get him on your show and you should ask him. So we now know that these types of technologies really do have significant impact in the way we live. And let's also acknowledge just how powerful they are, and in many ways how they've made life much easier for us. And I think that whenever we start to talk about ethics of technology and regulation of technology, we really need to start with a recognition that they've just delivered so much to so many of us that makes modern life more comfortable than our ancestors. If you wanted to be born at a different time, I doubt you'd say 1830, where you would die of polio or something. You'd probably say 2045, when we can live in the future. So then we've got this issue around where we are with AI, and there are things like humanoid robots, which I do think merit today a much wider discussion about what we want from them. So there are these startups have gone off and raised money, 700 million here, 200 here. Yeah. I'm not. Well, you know their names, right? And they've all got. They used to. At least one of them had a tweet, which I think got taken down, saying, we want every human to have a humanoid robot. So it's like, wait a second, 7.6 billion, 5'6" tall robots, you're setting out to change the world that much, like more than Haber Bosch did. That, I mean, that, and you've got that intentionality, and you're competent because the markets have given you millions of dollars. We should have a conversation about that, right, before you get the first thousand out, right? And I think that this is a moment where and one of the reasons why, with our conversation with you, I know you have a really technical audience. I bring them back to fiction and history and so on, is because I think it's really important that the audience hears the things that they're perhaps hearing less often, because this is the conversation that we have to have. I'm not saying a priori we don't want humanoid robots like lifting loads and preventing people getting back strain and so on. But I am saying that if the intent is to put 7.5 billion robots on the planet, there ought to be some sort of discussion about that, because, there might be some knock-on effects. I mean, there were some downsides to Instagram and notifications. There were some downsides to being able to produce lots of sugar in foods. I mean, we can have those conversations.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that I definitely kind of committed the mistake of that being embedded with my question that we are going to get this technology. And one thing that honestly really troubles me, and is part of why, same as you, I'm making an effort to bring on more historians on this podcast, for example, because I think they bring this point out in a really interesting light, is in technology so often, and OpenAI kind of did this in their charter, I feel, we make use of these inevitability narratives. And there's a bit of truth to it. Like, yes, there are lots of people out there who want to build powerful technologies. And so if OpenAI doesn't do it, somebody else might. But I do think that when we use this logic of historical inevitability to not just commit to, but kind of justify a vision that a certain set of people has, I find that a little bit of a troubling move. And I'm kind of curious how you think about, you see these a lot as well, I'm sure, with the people you speak to, this logic of this stuff is going to happen anyway. How do you think about that?
Well, something's going to happen anyway. Right. I think learning curves are going to continue to happen, and they are really hard to dislodge, because the knowledge is embedded, and it's codified in many different places. So even if something, when something terrible happened, like the Black Death, killed 30% of Europe's population, Europe recovered within 200 years, and today we would recover probably more quickly. And so I think learning curves have something of an inevitability about them. And because of that, the frontier of knowledge, the fact that continues to expand, the fact that we don't run out of it, also has a lot of room to run. And it's not like the old days. You're too young to remember this, but I once got to the end of Reddit about 15 years ago.
That exists?
You could get to the end of Reddit, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever gotten even to the end of a single subreddit. That's incredible.
It was very, very early days, yeah. So it was just a few thousand items on it or something. So I think we can be certain that learning curves continue, that knowledge and exploration can continue. There's lots of things we can't be certain of. So, for example, we didn't know that there were huge oil reserves in Pennsylvania or the Gulf of Louisiana or the North Sea in 1860. I mean, no one knew that. I mean, everyone knew they didn't exist. And yet there they were, right? The combination of new energy technologies, new information technologies, and people being able to organize themselves in a particular way, we discovered these things. So those are things that we can't be sure of. And we can't be sure of the trajectory of these technologies, in the way that Hinton admits he got it wrong. Like, they've gone much faster than he ever thought, and people who were bullish on self-driving cars have shown themselves to made the wrong kind of calculation. But if you the intentionality that you go into with does matter. And so I do find it a little bit troubling because it comes from a particular place, and that particular place is the complex intersection of cultures that exists within Silicon Valley, which has been really good at technological innovation, but it is a bit monocultural. The arguments between the EACs and whatever the inverse of an EAC is, it's a bit like an argument between brothers in a Italian mafia family, right? They at the end of the day, they're the same blood, and they'll kind of, in a way, stick together. And so a lot of the narratives, I think, are driven by the cultural influences that those types of people have. So I'm sure many more of them have read J.R.R. Tolkien or Terry Pratchett or Greg Bear than have read Annie Ernaux or Elena Ferrante or any of these literary fiction authors. And and so that's going to shape the way they think. And that we are at a different moment in terms of our understanding of what the impact of these technologies would be. And I also think fundamentally that I don't think that the big AI labs actually at the head believe that this technology is going to be impossible to control. But I do think, because I think the way they behave is also congruent to pursuing a strategy for commercial success, right? And I think that ultimately we have to be clear that this is, at this stage, this is software run by people who have shares in the software company, who need to behave in a particular way in order for that to be successful. And I don't think it hurts for us to think of it in those terms, and then say, given that's the case, how do we need to behave?
That's a very, very important point. What you said about the narratives we tell about history and how we project those into the future, that is really important, not to just have a single set of people being allowed to dominate the conversation of that kind of forward-looking story. Because as you said, it embeds a lot of cultural logics and the stories that people are familiar with and the ways that they're familiar with telling stories. There is this Silicon Valley culture of being really into things like rationality and using the word objectivity a little bit more generously than might be than might make sense.
Yeah, rationality and the has obviously been incredibly helpful. We call it the Age of Reason in Europe in the 17th century for really good reason. And just I find it astonishing that all these guys like Huygens and Descartes and Hobbes and and Galileo, they're kind of, if they were alive at the same time, they sort of all met each other at some point, and presumably it was harder to get around Europe back then than it is now. And so I think reason is really, really helpful. However, there are that's also embedded in a really particular moral framework, right? So it's a really utilitarian approach, which lends itself to the strengths and the weaknesses of utilitarian approaches. But one weakness of utilitarian approaches is that not everyone's a utilitarian. And lots of cultures have, because they are, they're path dependent. And so the shape of what matters to people is really, really different. We only have to look at highly committed religious communities and say, how do these people who opt out of the modern economy and all the benefits of globalization, how are they acting rationally? Because they're not maximizing their expected return, lifetime return. because they're spending time reading this religious book or praying and living on alms. I mean, I think that one of my concerns about that, the Rationality group and the sort of less wrong community, which, by the way, I love reading the stuff because it's just really, it's sort of, they pull our questions apart very well, is super fascinating, is just that the way societies should take, adapt their moral frames, or adapt their value systems should happen through, a process of either evolution or revolution. Evolution through whatever political reforms go on, and so on. Not by the back door through the code of the infrastructure on which everything will run, adhering to what is effectively a belief system. Right? So if for sake of argument, the extreme rationalists, EAs, end up running these companies, and these are the companies who build the very best AI systems that end up being running on the AWS cloud and running as core infrastructure, and embedded in them are these types of trade-offs. And we have known for decades that computer systems encode values of different types. Then we've found ourselves with systems that will essentially align to a particular ideology, but without having, had a chance to either storm the Bastille or go to the ballot box.
So many very important points there. I'm fully with you on this. One thing I wanted to kind of call out as interesting in the age of reason too, that I feel like we need to be really aware of, is also the kind of sequence of thinkers that we associate, and that a lot of our thinking comes out of, Descartes and so on. That's a historically Western tradition. And when you look at like Hegel's philosophy of history, for instance, one part of it that I learned from Thomas Mullany is that Hegel specifically called out the Chinese language, for instance, as something that is just backwards when it comes to his idea of the progression of history. And so this was a language that was subjugated when it comes to the logic of what it is to exist in the modern world and modernity, to have modern technology. He has this fascinating history of the Chinese typewriter, where our conception of what it is to be a typewriter, this used to be a pretty different, like a wide-ranging concept that could admit various different implementations. And over time, the idea of what it is to be a typewriter got foreclosed to this point that when I speak the words Chinese typewriter, that sounds to a lot of us like a fundamentally impossible object, because we have this set of driving assumptions about what it is to be a typewriter and the various logics that underlie what that is. That doesn't mean that it removes us from the frame we exist in, the logic we use to kind of understand and process the world. But I do feel like we need to be aware of that, especially when we are thinking about the methods of reason we use to kind of understand and construct technologies and like those logics that underlie them as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point, and the I think China is complicated, of course, right now because of Xi's increasing grip on the CCP and the view that essentially things work if they work for maintaining the CCP's control of power. He's extremely adaptable, in that way. But the other types, I mean, I want the other types of questions I think connect to, what are the cultural affordances that these systems will end up happening, and what we have seen is that from the internet, right? The internet, was a wonderful thing, but it emerged with this notion of a global standard when the globe of the internet was even less international than World Series baseball, right? It was just the US, and so that's been extended because the Americans have been the only ones who've been able to create global platforms, and what you see then therefore is that Facebook took a really long time to adapt to the minimum requirements of countries in which it operated. But you could argue that the way in which Facebook articulates itself could never have emerged from, the UK, let alone Pakistan or and some other country. What I've seen with the LLMs is that they're quite, as they've been trained. Claude in particular is quite sensitive and empathetic, and so if you pushed Claude and said, that's a bit whatever eccentric, or no, but let's look at it from the context of someone who's a practicing Christian in the UK. I think it has enough training material to be able to respond with that, with that hat on. And I think part of the challenge is going to be an economic one, because if it's going to cost $10 billion or $50 billion to train the next set of models, you're going to have to amortize that into a really, really big market. The US being the first. So could a poor country with a very distinct culture like Bangladesh afford that 50 billion? No, they can't at all. So they will either have to, use the set that's 2 years old, or hope that, at the whatever the succeeds the context window level, you can put enough of a cultural set of cues to make it relevant for that that geography, right? Because you're just not going to be able to have the economics of training your own system.
And I think that comes back to the society of AI point that you've made, that it's the idea of like a single monolithic system, whatever we want to call it in the future, that is really powerful. It's not going to be able to serve everybody. Yes, maybe Claude and can put on different hats and so on, but it feels like, as you're saying, it is going to be important that people with different use cases do have different systems with different sets of capabilities and maybe different cultural logics almost underlying them.
Yeah, but it's also, that's also, Daniel, the way that we live in the world today. So in a company, the CEO doesn't do everything, except maybe in Twitter or something. But you delegate out to lots of different people who've got different capabilities. And I think the reality of the market is that we will have AI systems that will be on phones and other devices, and a vendor decision for your expenses app that will be an AI system, and at some point we'll want them to start to connect to each other. And the idea that this gets to a singleton, which is where we were 15 years ago, in terms of the literature, it's quite hard to see how we get there. And if only because I can't work out how these big AI systems get over their own control problem, which is the speed of light. So, if you're a super powerful AI system, and you're based in a data center in Oklahoma, and you're trying to control an agent in Australia, well, even if you go through the Pacific, you're a 400 millisecond round trip time, which is, well, actually for one duration, right, to send the IP packet. That's an eternity for that robot to go off and do whatever the hell it wants to do, right? Because that's what we're arguing. These things think really quickly. They think in nanosecond terms. So I haven't been able to work out how a single monolithic AI is able to control every endpoint in its system without making them really, really dumb. And if they're dumb, then the next nearly good AI, which is local, will be smarter than the dumb thing that's local. And so how does that... So then my conclusion really was, well, until they get faster than the speed of light and they don't have this transmission time cost, we're going to have lots of... There are just going to be many of these systems. Does that make sense to you? You're much more technical than me. I mean, you probably thought about this harder than I have.
That seems right to me broadly. Yeah, it's I guess interesting just to think about. I mean, not having the 10 years hence versions of these systems yet, kind of projecting forward what that capability would look like and how it sort of trades off. But I think I totally agree with the high level principles of what you're saying.
Well, let's make it more explicit. Okay, so imagine we're 10 years hence, right? And you've got a super powerful AI. Let's imagine that Gemini is the one that wins. Okay, so we've got Gemini 15 out there, and there's a rover on the moon. How is Gemini going to control that rover? Right, it's going to take is it 2.5 seconds or something to get for the radio frequency signal to get to the moon?
That sounds about right.
Okay, so let's say it's it's 8 minutes to the sun, so let's say a couple of seconds to the moon, right? So what's that rover going to do in those 2 seconds? Now it's either an autonomous rover, or it's not. If it's not an autonomous rover, then we've only got one AI system and everything else is dumb. If it's autonomous, then how smart is it? And why doesn't it itself, in the 2.5 seconds it's away from Gemini 15, start to accumulate its own resources and take itself off on its own, take off? Because it's got all that time. And frankly, if you put it on Mars, it's got even more time, right? Because it can't be watched by the big super intelligence. So I haven't been able to work through the logic of that, but for me it's all about complicating the logic of this idea that these systems run away and control everything. And I think Jeff Hinton may argue that it's the scenario that I've described is actually worse, because he might argue that you would then have competing super smart systems all roughly on this kind of Pareto frontier of defining whatever intelligence is, and they're all competing with each other because no one can actually win, and that would be much worse for us. But I need to think much more about that. But my lesson for all of that is that there are so many uncertainties that what looks like something that you can turn into an engineering problem, which is where we were with self-driving cars in 2015 when Waymo's doodlebugs were zipping around Palo Alto. You just discover that there are many more problems. And I think so much of this currently hangs on the fact that one brilliant guy, Ray Kurzweil, was so accurate with some predictions he made 23 years ago. Because it often just comes back to, but Kurzweil predicted this, and these things are happening on his timeline. I mean, maybe it's survivorship bias, right? Maybe he has, or maybe it's not, right? But a lot of it ends up hanging on that particular question. That's not to say we don't see dramatic, shocking, weird outcomes, but it's just that there are so many, both degrees of freedom and constraints. It's just really hard to know.
It certainly is, yeah. I want to maybe bring it back to a different set of questions that I had for you, or a different question in terms of the kind of what we want out of these systems. And I think you're absolutely right that it's kind of hard to characterize some of these trade-offs. And at the same time, to what you said about more local systems in their environments, learning from that kind of feedback, that does seem to me like a more effective strategy for them to be able to be competent in that area. So thinking about like the moon rover, for instance, it is going to get that feedback, be able to learn and act on it in a more immediate environment. And so when I think about what that kind of means in terms of the Gemini 15 at the center versus the thing out there, that is a much quicker set of learning feedback. And if you believe that the kind of closed loop time between these things being able to get their updates and improve their performance and learn better policies is going to get really, really small, then those couple of seconds or couple of minutes it takes to sort of travel between, that actually does make a bit of a difference there. But another thing I've been thinking about recently that I wanted to get your take on is in interacting with a lot of the systems we have right now, we have trained them to be, and you used the words earlier, helpful, honest, and harmless. And one thing I'm thinking about is some of the applications we might put these things to. Scott Aronson had a really interesting one, which was helping maybe young teenage boys, for instance, get a little bit better in terms of navigating social cues and social situations. And in a case like that, you actually might not want the most helpful, honest, harmless thing in terms of your interaction style. And this also kind of came up in when I was speaking with June Park about the generative agents paper. Part of that like emergent thing that happened with all of the agents getting together to throw a party was because they are trained to be so cooperative in their interaction. And again, if you want to simulate something that is a little bit more realistic, maybe you want something that's a bit more antagonistic. And I saw at least one paper that was diving into the idea of this recently. But at the same time, when you introduce that element of antagonism, the reason that we are training these things to be helpful, honest, and harmless is that's kind of the lowest chance of risk. But maybe we do want different qualities out of them. And I'm kind of curious how you think about some of those trade-offs.
Uh, I think we do for the powerful models. You you probably need to train them in the way that we are. In the kind of example that Scott raised, I mean, two things come to mind. One is that we always probably speak from our own experiences, right, as to the thing that we want it to be able to do. I want it to be able to clean my room, and an example like that would really be for me about the principle of non-maleficence, so no chance that it does harm. The principles of non-misrepresentation, so it can't represent itself as a person, and absolutely designed to respect the person's well-being and dignity and agency. And so that would be a little bit like saying, well, it's a therapeutic and it has to adhere to a very, very different standard to the system that we're going to use for handling late payments for your utility bills. And do you need to build that out of Claude 3, 4, 5, 6, or do you actually need it to be effective? And so a good example of this is cognitive behavioral therapy. So when you do CBT, it's this kind of constrained world of your kind of problem set with a set of really specific tools that you then execute on. They are not the answer to life, the universe, and everything. You execute on those tools and you get the outcome that you want. Those tools will not help you with other types of psychological problems. They may not help you with a trauma. They may not help you with a this or a that. And they're not the be all and end all of therapeutics for any condition. And yet they're what works for that specific requirement. And a use case like the one that Scott described, social anxiety, and is definitely in that liminal space between, do I just want to ask GPT-4 how to do this, or do I want to get professional help around this? And if it's the latter, you would just design the thing that you need to design, and maybe it is much, much more constrained, and maybe because of the risks, you use a model that's much easier to control, which might be one that's 2 or 3 years out of date. In exactly the same way that if you're in the United Kingdom and you want to learn how to drive, you cannot get insurance on a car that costs more than £30,000, which is like $40,000. Kind of on the basis that way you can't be driving a Ferrari, right? Because you want to be driving like a 1 litre, 75 horsepower car that's small when you learn how to drive, especially if you're in London. And I can see that, for these types of uses, you might want to be saying, well, actually, the standard for which this thing gets tested, this is a mental health tool to help social anxiety, is going to be very, very different to the thing that helps me, figure out what weeds I've got in my garden.
That seems absolutely right. Perhaps my final question then is, we've been talking a lot about specific cases of what the future looks like, things we might want out of these systems. What are, I guess I'm kind of curious about your personal outlook when it comes to what would you personally like to see out of AI systems? Maybe you want them to help with your garden or cleaning up your house or something like this. What's the most hopeful version of the future for you?
Over what time period, Daniel?
Ooh, okay. How about
That really matters.
sure. Let's say how about we say 10 years and then we also say 40 years?
Oh, wow. Those are both hard.
Yes.
So, you know, two things have really made modern society. One is our ability to harness energy, and the other is our ability to apply information. And the two are somewhat fungible. So I'll give you a short example here, right? If you're the Russian army invading Ukraine, what you have is a lot of energy. So you fire 1,000 artillery tubes to effect. If you're the Ukrainians, you don't have as much energy. You've got one artillery tube, but it's got information with it, which is a GPS guidance, and you fire one shell and you have the same impact. The two are somewhat fungible. Many poor countries are poor because they don't have institutions, but they're also poor because they don't have human capital. So when you pull those two ideas together, we have an opportunity to vastly expand the amount of human capital that exists. The reason Zambia, where I was born, one reason it doesn't have many doctors is because doctors are too expensive and Zambia can't afford them. If whatever comes after GPT-5 can do 95% of what a doctor does, we've reduced the cost of getting doctors and we've expanded the ability to deliver that into those countries. And the same is true across the economy because cognition is one of the heavy input costs into what delivers prosperity. So I'm excited about the prospect for vastly increasing the amount of the cognitive capacity in the economy. And there are things that concern me about that. One of the key ones is that one way of looking at the cognitive cost of the economy is that it's also human wages. So we have to, tackle that question. And the second thing is that these systems are not particularly transparent. And what we have, and what I mean by that is we've established that digital marketplaces and any other system that's mediated by algorithms can extract what economists call a rent, which is an economic return that is above what's justified. And partly you can do that because of your market power and because of the lack of transparency. And I can see that being a risk that emerges from this system. But fundamentally, I'm really excited about the prospect of having more brains in the room. 40 years. Okay, so we can think through this a little bit. So over 40 years, as I suspect that we will see a fundamental cultural and value-based fragmentation of society. So the Starbucksization, the crossfitification of the world that has gone on over the last 40 years will stop having the same economic return. And the reason that will happen is that courtesy of this cognitive expansion, but also courtesy of energy system changing, things like energy independence and food independence will be much, much more affordable for coherent political agglomerations, nation states, or cities or regions within nation states. And because of that, the vig that the West has been able to take for allowing you to participate in the global economy, which is, we've got to roll McDonald's out, will not need to be paid anymore. And so there's a possibility that communities within whatever kind of defines themselves sensibly will be able to develop with a degree of diversity because these automated infrastructures are maintaining like an adequate level of prosperity or a growing level of prosperity. And then I think within that, you might see very, very different pathways. So you might see communities that end up becoming much more traditionally conservative and having lots of children and so on. And you might see communities where they've even forgotten about what replacement rate looks like. You might see the early starts of that because we're talking 40 years, not 100 years, and really supplanted by automated labor. But I think that there is a small possibility that as we move towards something that is less zero sum in terms of the political economy, that it just creates a bit more space for groups of people to be themselves, and in ways that will be incredibly uncomfortable. Them as they think of me, and I as they think of them, and you as they think of them, and so vice versa, right? But I could imagine that it could take us to a diversity of cultural expression. Whereas when you think about sort of Star Trek futures, it's actually they think about a monotype, right? That emerges, but maybe 40 years we might see the hints of that.
I think that's a great place to end. Azeem, I really admire your work. This has been a very, very interesting, thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for doing this.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. I look forward to it and continue to read The Gradient.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to my guest, Azeem. Let me know how you liked the episode and any other feedback you have. And I will see you next time.